Welcome to Episode 3, Construction Nation. This is Sue Dyer, your host for Construction Dream Team, where I interview industry leaders and experts so you can learn how to build your construction dream team. Based on OPE, other people's experiences, the shortest way to success is to learn from others who have been there and done that. And we are so happy today to have Pete Davos with us. Hi, so today we have a guest, again, one of my favorite people, and wanted to bring you a case study of a project team that really faced overwhelming challenges, and yet despite this, they stayed together, pressures mounting, and all sorts of things happening to them. And so I thought Pete Davos could come and share with us more insights as to what happened on this project and what did he, as the leader, as one of the leaders, and the project team do in order to really create a successful project despite what was going on. All projects face challenges from outside forces, but this one really takes the case, and I've never seen such organized, really environmental terrorism. So welcome, Pete. Thanks for coming and sharing with Construction Nation here on the Construction Dream Team podcast. Pete Davos is the Vice President and Operations Manager for De Silva Gates Construction, and he was one of the partners on this project, which I'll let him tell you more about that. And he's going to share with us his insights, and we're going to share together what you can do to maybe think about your projects differently because of what this team learned. Welcome.
Thank you, Sue.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey in the construction industry. How'd you get to where you're doing, what you're doing now?
So way back when, 100 years ago, I was down at San Jose State, and I was actually a civil engineering major. And the last couple of years at San Jose State, helping to pay my way through school, was working for an architect lady. And one of my buddies at school said, hey, we ought to start the student chapter for AGC at the school. And it was a good idea, so I said, okay, we can do that. So we started this student chapter, got involved with AGC, and one of the first meetings I went to, one of their quarterly meetings, I got introduced to a fellow at Piazza Construction who offered me a job, part-time job. Back then we just worked, and we didn't call it internships, we just worked. And I went from kind of even though I got my degree in civil engineering and completed that process, went to work in the construction industry, graduated in '82, worked for Piazza Construction for 1 year, and then got hooked up with a company called Oliver De Silva back in '83, which eventually turned into De Silva Gates Construction, and I've been there 35 years.
Wow. So you guys mostly do general engineering, paving, grading type of
That's correct.
projects.
That's correct. We're a heavy civil company. Grading and paving is our specialty. The greater Bay Area, 9 Bay Area County region, as well as Sacramento Valley and the San Joaquin Valley.
So tell us a little bit about this project that spent $6 million for police services.
So De Silva Gates Construction and Flatiron Construction joined together, created a joint venture to bid a $170 million project up in Willits, California. It's about 3 hours north of the Bay Area on a stretch of Highway 101 where typically Highway 101 would dive down into a small town, go through the town with several signalized intersections, and the project was to build a new 101 bypass around the town of Willits with an intersection, full freeway intersection at the south end of town and a full freeway intersection at north side of town. Project was about 6 miles long, a few stats. It had about 1 million yards of roadway excavation, about 1 million yards of import borrow, 15 bridge structures, including one a 6,000-foot span over a wetland, and it impacted not just those wetlands, but a number of other environmentally sensitive areas. It had an extensive environmental restrictions built into the contract. Caltrans had to negotiate with any number of regulatory agencies, including the U.S. Army Corps, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and Fish and Wildlife, among others. And so it was a complex job. It was a large job. It was intended to be a 4-year project. And when we bid the job and tried to get started, the first thing we encountered was we had people living in the trees. You mentioned earlier environmental terrorism. It was the first project in my at that time, about 32 years or 33 years in the construction industry, 32 years, I think, that we had to deal with people living in trees to prevent the clearing of the trees to allow the bypass to go through the right-of-way. And one of the gals that was living up in the trees actually lived in the trees, I think, for almost 5 months. By the end of it, there was over 20 people living in trees, and the CHP eventually had to take them out of the trees forcefully to allow the project to just literally get started. So the project was, by the fact that folks were living in the trees, the project encountered delays right from the get-go. Very, very difficult situation for everybody.
So sounds like the people were living in trees. How did that affect the project? You couldn't tear down those trees? Were there protesters? Was it police around? What happened?
Yeah. So the project from south to north at the south end of the job was heavily forested for the first couple of miles of the project. So there was quite a bit of clearing and grubbing that needed to be done. And the environmentalists, which this project, as I understand, had been in the works at Caltrans, I believe, for over 50 years. And it was finally coming to fruition, any number of lawsuits along the way that Caltrans had to deal with. And here we were, Caltrans had put out a contract that we were low bidder on. And here we were literally at the beginning of the project. We couldn't do the first operation to start the project at the south end of the project, which was to clear the trees, to then be able to do the roadway excavation, to start building bridge abutments, start building embankments for a new roadway. So literally the very first activity on the job is affected by the environmentalists, which are opposed to the project and trying to get the project shut down. In fact, there was ongoing lawsuits. I think through the first 2 years of the project, there were ongoing lawsuits that Caltrans was continuing to fight as the project was trying to get built. So that was the very beginning of it. Caltrans brought in CHP to assist with clearing the people out of the trees, which was an enormous effort on the CHP's part. And then once that happened, quite frankly, we just ran into a series of problems with protests along the way for the first 2 years of the project, including literally people chaining themselves to the equipment, chaining themselves to the trucks driving through town at night when we would do our excavation at night, load the trucks with dirt to haul to the north end of the job to build abutments. The trucks would roll up to a stoplight, and as they came to a full stop when the light was red, the environmental protesters would go out and literally chain themselves to the trucks so the trucks wouldn't be able to go forward without pulling these people on the ground. So of course they wouldn't do that. I learned what a die-in is. I had never heard that phrase before, where the people just literally laid down in front of our equipment as our equipment was working on the site. So they were putting, obviously, themselves at risk, but essentially putting our own people at risk because, without guidance, what do you do? What do you do? And from that very beginning, when the CHP showed up to pull the 20 or so folks out of the trees, from that moment through the course of the job, first job I've ever been on where they had CHP as security throughout the project, primarily the south end and north end of the project, but also as the project was built out throughout the project, constantly 24/7 to essentially guard the site from the environmental protesters, essentially.
And what effect did this have on the psyche of the construction team? I'm thinking not just the contractor side, but the owner side and everyone involved.
Well, as anybody could imagine, incredibly frustrating for those of us that are in the business to build work, whether you're an owner or a contractor we're all used to dealing with what I kind of refer to as the normal construction problems we run into day to day to day. Things like we don't get compaction, so we can't, process the next layer of material on the subgrade, or we find a buried man-made object, or maybe there's an issue with the way the specifications are written and we disagree on how we get paid for something, or maybe the owner just wants to add work and we're trying to negotiate how to add that work and deliver the project still on time. So all of the normal things we deal with regarding stormwater pollution or the CPM or just the day-to-day administration of the project or building of the project, it was incredibly impacted in a negative way by all of the protesters and the issues that were going on, because we could never get any momentum in the first 2 years to build anything. The problems at the front end of the job with the protesters and the trees, the die-ins, the chaining to the equipment, we were on the job 1 full year, and we were 1 full year behind schedule through trying to prosecute the work.
So in essence, they achieved what they set out to do.
That's right. They basically got the job ground to a halt, so to speak. The stress on everybody was profound because, again, the normal things that us contractors and owners are used to dealing with in constructability issues and change order issues and schedule issues, we were now dealing with something that, quite frankly, none of us had gone to school for and none of us had trained for, which was, as you mentioned, kind of the environmental terrorism or eco-terrorists. At one point, the Caltrans staff, which was located in an office about midway through the project within the right-of-way, they actually had the protesters rush their doors, damage their front door, I believe, injured in a way, not badly, not horribly, but injured a couple of the workers there. So suddenly it went from not just having CHP on the site, trying to keep the site from being terrorized, if you will, by the protesters and have equipment damages by the protesters. We now had to have protection for some of the Caltrans workers, certainly, which caused a whole another set of struggles for everybody to just actually meet and talk about the job and work on the job. We could never really talk about the project for the construction of the project, if that makes sense. We just always were dealing with these protesters and these situations. One of the other interesting examples was we finally got to a section of the job that required us to put wick drains into the existing ground. And our wick drain subcontractor came out with 2 drill rigs. So wicks are driven into the ground by these drill rigs. And the CHP was out there because there was a group of protesters that came out to protest the work activity to try and stop the work from progressing. And what the protesters did, which obviously was well planned out on their part, was they essentially had a group of protesters talking to the 2 CHP officers while 2 other protesters climbed up the drill rigs. And sure enough, one of them camped in a drill rig, I think, for a couple of days. The other one camped in the drill rig for a week. If you could imagine a drill rig, vertical drill rig up in the air about 40 feet, and there's a guy somehow perched up on top of the drill rig. So even though the CHP's presence was there, unfortunately, they weren't able to take a real proactive stance to prevent. They just tried to negotiate with the protesters, and this also caused a lot of stress for the work team, at least I think from the Caltrans side and our side, as we would get together, because again, we were looking for action to be taken, and it was, instead of we were taking proactive action by the CHP, it was more of a passive action. And those of us who are in construction are used to actually taking proactive action to get something built, proactive decision making, not passive action and passive decision making. So it was frustrating for the first year, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's, the whole idea of terrorism is to create terror, or at least in your mind, worry.
Yeah, and they did that. Yeah.
Sounds like, a team under siege has that mentality as well.
It was very difficult. It was hard to have a meeting for the first 12 months of the year, maybe a little bit longer, where the focus of the meeting wasn't what's CHP doing and can we work in that area and where are the protesters at. And so again, if for those of us that go to meetings to meet with a client or meet with a contractor to build work and talk about the work schedule and the 3-week schedule and the issues, the change orders being processed properly and the RFIs being addressed and the submittals, all the things we all love to do to build the job and then go build it, we just weren't able to get to any of that for a good 12 months, maybe a little bit longer.
So you've done a good job of painting the picture of kind of where we're at. So tell me, what did you do to help this team stay together and get this project built?
So I think one of the most important things we did, the De Silva Flatiron team, many of us had worked together before on other large Caltrans projects, quite frankly, as joint ventures. We had experience together as a team on the contractor side. And although we were in District 1 on this particular project, this district was managed by the same executive management as District 3, where we'd done other projects. So the executive management for Caltrans and our exec team were we knew each other very well. We're well versed in working out problems together. Both exec teams were well versed in partnering projects and overcoming issues with partnering. And from the very beginning on this project, we, as you well know, we hired a partnering facilitator, which was you. And part of, I think, answering that question is the fact that through having the facilitator, when we would have our monthly meetings with the exec group, we always it helped having the facilitator in the room help us kind of reset. Where's our base? Where's the foundation? Where are we coming from? What is our vision as a team for the project to maintain us coming back to kind of square one almost each time that we had to, because every time we try to get ahead of ourselves, there was so much going on with, again, remember this $175 million project, a very complex project in its own right, that now has been doubled down as far as complexity to figure out how to work the project, work the problem, solve the problem with all of this other eco-terrorism stuff going on. So having a facilitator in the room, I think having the two exec groups being very, very committed to the process, staying true to that, which was difficult. It was difficult, as you well know. It was very difficult for some of us because of the fact that there was a lot of frustration because nothing could get done. The contractor side was starting to get frustrated because the project was being delayed in our minds through no fault of our own. We had a lot of overhead on the project. We had a lot of equipment on the project. Caltrans, of course, had no way to understand and see the future of how we were going to get out of the mess and build the job. We were 1 year behind, 1 year in. That was a real struggle for the executive group from Caltrans to understand. They had to go to headquarters to get help, I think, from their end and being empowered to help solve the problem. But coming back to the core team, back to the RE, back to our project manager, the project manager for De Silva and Flatiron, it was important that they saw the exec leadership continue to stay true on course, true to ourselves on what we were trying to achieve on the project, and keep coming back to our foundation, if you will, of why are we here, what are we trying to achieve, what's success going to look like for the job, and try to take maybe smaller bites, if you will, out of the elephant, the proverbial elephant, rather than trying to swallow the whole thing, rather than trying to figure everything out. We were just trying to take maybe 2 or 3 month chunks that we can wrap our mind around and go prosecute work based on 2 or 3 months at a time, as opposed to 12 months at a time.
That sounds right. So you talked about process. So what kind of process did you use to kind of get together and stay together? You talked about an executive team. What was that like?
So I think with a lot of help from a lot of folks, I think at some point we got to almost monthly meetings, or once every 2 months. We would bring the exec team in together, go over all those issues. You got to remember, most people that are in construction, the way our minds work, we identify a problem, we start identifying one or more solutions to the problem, and then we just start working the problem, trying to find the solution and work it. So I think that's what we did. We just stuck to it. We kept our nose to the grindstone, so to speak. And as the exec team would revisit the vision and revisit what we were trying to achieve. We would then try and convey it in a consistent manner to the core team, which made up the managers from both JV partners, the RE, and their staffs, because their staffs were the ones that were in the trenches, so to speak, day to day with everything that was going on. It was the RE and his staff and the PMs and their staffs that were dealing with it daily. The exec teams, of course, are not dealing with it daily. We're not on the job daily. So delivering that message and having the core teams actually see the exec teams united and unified as far as what we were going to try and do each step along the way, I think was really crucial. I know it sounds very simple, but it is that simple. You just have to stick to it and keep going, have perseverance to keep working the problem, not let the problem overwhelm you, which it did a little bit.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like you, at some point, there was a decision or somewhere it worked out that you guys decided to work with each other instead of against each other.
Well, I think
that could have easily happened.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I remember clearly the point in time. We got to a point in time, and Caltrans certainly had to help lead that, where both the executives from the contractor, myself included, the executive, John Rodriguez, so to speak, as the executive for Caltrans, we came to an agreement where we weren't going to worry about the money. We were going to worry about the project, and we were going to figure out how to build the project. Once we took that off the plate, once we took the money off the plate, so to speak, and I'll come back to that, but once we took the money issue off the plate for not just the exec team, but for the core team, that what was critical so that everybody could just focus on what was the best solution for the project, which we all know is really the best thing. But let's face it, we're on a job to make money. We're not on a job not to make money. Caltrans has a budget they have to meet. They have restrictions on how much they can spend and how they want to spend it. But it took that effort first. We certainly eventually came back to the money, and we knew we were going to have to come back down the road and face that, which we did, but it was actually 2 years later. And I think John Rodriguez, on behalf of Caltrans, myself, and a couple other guys from Flatiron, we worked really hard at getting everybody just not to worry about it at the moment. So I think that was part of kind of the tipping point to get the team from not so much not working together, but not being able to see how working together they could solve anything, because everything was starting to revolve around the money. We were being delayed, the contractors being delayed. Caltrans can't build anything. They can't write us a blank check. They can't just say yes to everything. And yet, how do we move the ball forward? The money was getting in the way, so to speak. The thought of the money, the solve the money part of the equation was getting in front of everything. So we had to take it off. We took the money issue completely off the table, and we focused on the job. And I think that was a big tipping point. And that wasn't easy to get to. That was hard.
Yeah, no, it's not easy to do that, but it is essential because money doesn't really solve the problem, especially in this case, because it's a very fluid, dynamic thing that's going on.
And I think the other part that I think it took us a while to get there, I think less so for the contractors group, but more so for the Caltrans group, we also had to teach our own staff, the RE and his staff, our PMs and their staff, that they were empowered. They were so overwhelmed with all of the problems on the job that first year or so, they couldn't make any decisions, or they didn't think they could make any decisions without their bosses making decisions. So again, unlocking the key on the job, I think, was taking the money off the table, number one, and number two, reinforcing with all the staff, the RE, his staff, and the PMs and their staff, that they were empowered to make decisions that were good for the job, make decisions, don't get locked down, don't get handcuffed into making no decision because they couldn't figure out how somebody was going to solve the money. So again, by taking the money off the table, we said, just go get the best solution, go figure it out. You guys are building the job. You guys are good. They're good, quality, smart people out there. They know how to build the work. The Caltrans folks know how to build the work. They know how to administrate the contract. And getting them empowered to make their own decisions, I think, also helped it tremendously.
Yeah, so people closest to the issues resolving the issues.
Yes.
But I'm sure there were times when they didn't agree. So what happened then?
Well, the challenge there would be trying to get which disagreements really should have been, so to speak, elevated up. Because in the beginning, until we got the money off the table and empowering people issue address consistently, it was hard to get the guys not to elevate everything. But eventually they started solving things, and there was a few things that they couldn't solve, but it was for different reasons. And some of those reasons, both parties knew they had to get input from the executive group. And so they learned over the course of the time. The team started growing, and I think they gained some traction as they were able to finally start year two, as they were finally able to start solving some stuff, as the team, meaning the RE and his staff and the PMs and their staff. And as they started solving stuff, as they started moving the ball forward by building work and seeing progress on the project, I think it reinforced with them on which issues, if they did disagree. Quite frankly, at the end, it really, the only disagreement we really all had on the job at the end of it was what we had to solve 2 years later, was how to deal with the first year of delay. Ultimately, there really wasn't that much that got elevated because the guys were empowered to solve it, and they actually started doing it. The few times they didn't, meaning our staff, the contractor staff, as well as Caltrans staff, we simply had to reinforce what needed to be done, which was to get in the room, roll up your sleeves, and do the work, and do the math, and the issues that we have, of course, when you're a contractor dealing with a real contract, you have to read the contract, see what it says, find where you can help your partner out, solve a problem without necessarily reading every word in the contract. And Caltrans was very fair about that, and we think we were as well. So that's how the things got resolved at
So
the end.
fairness seems like it's a pretty important part of all of this too, is both sides looking for what's a fair way to resolve the issues given these extraordinary circumstances. It also sounds to me like, was there perhaps some creative ideas that came out of all of this?
Yes.
What were some of those?
Well, I think on the job, some of the creative ideas had to do with, where Caltrans, as an example, was wanting to get their import bar. There's about 1 million yards of import bar that was needed, and they had a borrow site that was 2.5 miles up the road. And we ended up finding another borrow site of an old sawmill, and Caltrans actually worked with us. We worked hand in hand to help the owners of the old sawmill site fend off a lawsuit. Everybody was in agreement that it was better to get the sawmill site was adjacent to the project as opposed to a natural, undisturbed piece of property that Caltrans owned 2.5 miles away from the job. So that was an example of kind of working together to solve something at the job that you could put your hands around, that was meaningful, because we had to go get 1 million yards of dirt from somewhere. There was other ways that we tried to overcome certain of the protesters. Caltrans really stepped up hard by negotiating with the city of Willits on several issues, by going out to the city council meetings, which was no fun at all. Our project manager also went to several city council meetings. So I don't know how creative those things are, but typically the contractor doesn't try and get too involved with the public, but about communicating with the public of what we were doing. Because quite frankly, as we all know, there was a vast majority of people that were in favor of the project, and just a minority, the loud minority, that was against the project. But once we worked through a few of those things, deciding where to meet, how to meet, when to meet, as well as the constructability issues, what's interesting is by the second year, the team had started working together in such a way that sitting here today in 2018, we finished the job in 2016. It's hard actually to remember all of the different things because there were so many of them along the way. The team just started finding itself being empowered to solve problems, and not to jump all the way to the finish line, but it got to a point where you get to the conclusion of the job, and there's not just the traditional ribbon cutting ceremony, but we end up having a huge dinner at a local restaurant where the Caltrans staff of 20 or 25 people come, the contractor staff of another 20 or 25 people come, the Caltrans folks and the contractor folks. We put together these books about the project that showed a hardcover bound book with pictures and just stuff that we'd never done with any client before. We had, as you know, we had the Willits bumper stickers, Save Willits bypass, And so there was all these fun things we were trying to do that we're trying to reinforce that we actually were in the business to have fun. It's a tough business to begin with, and to get to the finish line, mentioning fairness again, getting to the finish line where both parties feel they did a good job and they can compliment each other. And if you were at the dinner, you just see all the players that were there and would talk about how much fun they had on the job. It was almost as if they'd all forgotten what happened 4 years earlier, 4 years earlier on the job. It's amazing.
That's funny. So I know, too, the team had figured out a way to save a year off time, too, on the project, which was pretty remarkable as well, and then fully executed that.
Yeah, that was much more about Caltrans recognizing at some point when we finally started figuring out how we were going to get the job in on time, how to make up a year of time. And with Caltrans's help, we were able to accelerate the work we actually made up about a year's worth of time from the first year of delay, which Flatiron did on all their structure work, De Silva did on all the road building work. We set hard target dates, which everybody does, but we set hard target dates and held each other accountable. We would have these monthly meetings, let alone the project team on the project. We're having weekly meetings, of course, but the exec team was meeting monthly, as you know, to hold ourselves accountable and essentially not let any of our deliverables slip past the dates that we had set to achieve the end result, which was ultimately delivering it on time. And that was after we were on the job for 2 years when we determined that we could still maybe make a push and do that.
So what part do you think partnering played, truthfully, in the project?
So you know me a little bit, so I'll tell a brief story maybe. As I grew up in the industry in the 80s and worked on many Caltrans projects, I'd never heard the word partnering before. What I did with my boss when I was a young engineer, what I did with my boss was I go to lunch a lot, watch my boss have maybe a cocktail or two with his counterpart, which we can't do anymore, but his counterpart from Caltrans. And I'd watch them, for lack of a better term, negotiate or talk about the problems and negotiate solutions and how are they going to solve it. I never once saw a contract being brought to lunch. I never saw anybody looking at the contract. Back in the 80s, we were able to maybe deliver a turkey or two and say, thank you for working with me on the project, for the season. We actually developed relationships with our counterpart, our clients. They're clients. Caltrans is a client. We have any number of private clients. Our company does probably 65% of our work with private clients. So we're client driven. We know clients have deliverables that they want to finish their projects, finish them by a certain date for all the reasons they have. By the time we get to the Willits project in 2012 and 2013, there's formal partnering, facilitated partnering, and quite frankly, the way it's structured now, it's hard not to build a project of that complexity without facilitated partnering, without collaborative partnering. If we don't have it, and it starts with the executives, of course, but it helps having the facilitator in the room kind of help us stay on course, help kind of being that nonpartisan person in the room without taking sides to help each side be pushed along a little bit. But without partnering, without having the right executive partnership at the top end, it probably doesn't happen. The guys would have been drugged down through the first year of all the issues that parlayed itself into the year delay, all the protesters. And to this date, we probably would have still be looking to go to court over a $10+ million in disputes. So all of those issues, I guess now saying it, all those issues really culminated in over $10 million in disputes. Those $10 million disputes, we ended up, for those of us that know Caltrans work, we ended up with a PFE that was pretty clean, and we worked through the PFE, and we had 0 claims when we were done negotiating everything out with the state at the job level, so to speak, post PFE. But we had nothing go to arbitration, which was amazing when we had over $10 million in disputes just 2 years earlier. And none of that would have happened without collaborative partnering.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, what a team. So this is what I've heard from you to kind of summarize it for the listeners. So take the money off the table so that your team can deal with the issues. Empower the people closest to the issues to actually resolve them. Make sure you have a good executive team that can steer the team, that has a vision that stays together. That executive team sounds like it's critical, especially on these larger complex projects. Without that, your team down below is going to have a much harder time knowing what to do. And when they get stuck, they have no place to go. And then structured collaborative partnering for these larger projects, especially if there's conflict, is going to be pretty essential.
Yeah, the collaborative partnering, what it ultimately allowed us to do was to have the difficult conversation, to address the difficult subject, to be okay that it was in the room, to not address it, so to speak. I think that was one of the critical things to having the partnering facilitator in the room, because both parties know the facilitator's there. Both parties talk to the facilitator outside the room and then inside the room, but it helped make it easier for having that, what I call the difficult conversation, the conversation that's tough to have. Because once you have it, the second time you address that subject, the third time you address that same subject, pretty soon it's not a difficult conversation, it's just part of the process of solving the problem, what was initially almost impossible to think about.
So you can really talk about anything.
Yes.
This team, too, used partnering in some other unique ways. As I recall, there was a senior level executive environmental partnering process and some partnering processes with some stakeholders. There was some work pretty ongoing.
Yes, that first year as we got into some of the challenges with a couple of the regulatory agencies, we had asked Caltrans, myself and a couple others, we promoted the idea of why don't we go to the regulatory agency's home office, knock on the door nicely. Of course, you would set that up in advance and bring a cup of sugar and see if they would sit with us and talk with us. Initially, Caltrans didn't think that was a good idea. They had already felt they had negotiated their permit with the regulatory agencies. They'd done everything they needed to do. I would say it didn't take long for us to kind of get Caltrans' vision of our idea turned around a little bit and see the perspective that we were looking at, the optics so that we were looking at the problem, which was let's go be their partners, not just have them as a regulatory agency coming out to police us of whatever we were doing. So yeah, we went up to U.S. Army Corps' offices, we went to Fish and Wildlife's offices, and we went to the Regional Water Quality Control Board's offices. And it got to the point where we even had the Regional Water Quality Control Board come to one of our partnering sessions, if you recall. Mm-hmm. Wasn't always pretty. It was, in fact, a couple of those meetings were kind of ugly. Very difficult discussions with the regulatory agency. They're very demanding. But again, once you start just kind of understanding what their perspective is, especially with the water board, what started out to be somewhat acrimonious, ended up being a true partnership, I think, with them, because ultimately they actually, we think, got on board and had their inspector would come out to the site, work with us to avoid the problems that none of us wanted anyway. Mm-hmm. So they would actually help guide us on things that we should have been doing and be aware of. Because even though we think we're doing all those things, having his perspective assisted us in avoiding problems. And to the best of my knowledge, we ended up with, I won't say none, but we didn't end up with any major discharges or any major violations with the water board. We had one issue that we had to deal with from the early part of the job, and we never really had any issues with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We had one issue with the Army Corps that got resolved fairly quickly. So hard now, all this time later, to see what impact that might have had, but I know personally that was something Caltrans wouldn't have done if we hadn't pushed for it. And we felt it was worth it. We felt it was worth the effort. And we think that, in our own way, we think that helped. And that was partnering.
It sounds to me like really the paradigm of partnering is not just a process, it's a way of thinking about your relationships.
That's correct. Yeah.
That we are going to work together no matter what.
Well, the thing everybody has to get over is what's the most important thing. So if you're building a project, the project's the most important thing. Putting the project first, and then kind of deal with the stuff that falls off of that, because it's not simple, it's not easy. People have budgets, people have expenses. Contractors can't do work for free. All the challenges that come with it. But if you put the project first, typically good people, smart people, and if you have a trusted partnership, they'll come up with one or two solutions that probably are pretty good and probably the right solutions. And then they'll embrace it because they own it. and they'll sell it to their own sides, so to speak.
Yep. So share with us a resource that our listeners might be able to enjoy. What's something that you think would be helpful to our listeners?
So I don't. I used to be a pretty big reader, and then unfortunately, as I got older, and every time I would read a book late at night, I'd end up falling asleep. So I wasn't reading as much as I used to. And one day I found this book. I can't even tell anybody how I found it, because I was in a bookstore with my wife and my son, and we're going through the bookstore, and my son was looking for certain things, and I don't even know what section I was in, and I found this book, and it was called The Four Obsessions of an Extraordinary Executive. And it's by, and I'll mispronounce his last name, by Patrick Lencioni. So it was a small little book. I don't even remember if it was even a couple hundred pages long. And I flipped through the book in the bookstore, and I said, I'll grab this, I'll go home, because I must be an extraordinary executive, so it must be something I could see and learn from. So I'm glad you smiled about that. So I took the book home, and quite frankly, it was an easy read, meaning it wasn't that long, it wasn't overly technical. It was a fictional story about two executives that ran two really nice companies, really good companies, but how one executive's company kind of sort of fell apart, and one executive's company kept growing and kept doing more and kept doing more. And as I read through the book, I've actually passed this book around to several of my top leadership guys, and I've suggested it to a few people I respect in the industry, and suggested that they should read it. I found that the book is going to do one of two things. It's either going to help you understand what maybe separates extraordinary leaders, and maybe reinforce some of the things that you hope you're doing as an executive anyway with your teams. So it's called The Four Obsessions of an Extraordinary Executive, and it's by Patrick Lencioni. And he's written other books, but that one really struck home with me, because it really provided in a fictional way, it provided some pretty solid examples of what somebody could do to help lead their team through difficult times, and how do you stay true to your vision. And if it works, you stick with it, and you help pass it around, and somewhat like collaborative partnering, it grows on itself. It just continues to grow. So that was a good book for me to read.
That's cool. He also wrote The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And what we will do in the show notes, we will have information for you on how you can get that book. So, so with that, Pete, how about if you tell people how they might get a hold of you, and give our listeners some parting advice, and then we'll say goodbye.
So, unfortunately, I'm not on LinkedIn, and my wife always asks me, but I'm not on Facebook or Instagram. We have a company website, and certainly somebody really wanted to get a hold of me, they could certainly contact you and get a hold of me through that way.
Certainly true.
Advice. I had a couple thoughts on that. I read a little bit, as I mentioned, not as much as I'd like sometimes. Two things I thought that I wanted to share. I came across something, and I thought I kind of mashed it up a little bit to kind of fit how I think about collaborative partnering. But trusted partners mutually create a vision for the project. We were talking about Willits. That's what I think our executive group did. We mutually created a vision for the project, a vision for success. We have to articulate it constantly, articulate it to the entire team, and articulate it all the way down through the team structure. And the partners have to passionately own the vision. So it's not my vision, or in this case, Caltrans' vision on Willits. It has to be both partners' vision. And if they do that, and they relentlessly drive it to completion, they will achieve whatever it is they're trying to achieve, whatever their vision was. My little bit of advice, it's probably already come through here, is for any of my troops, I always tell them, stay true to yourself, stay true to your convictions. Don't shy away from those difficult conversations. You'll work your way better. You'll work better through the difficult conversations if you stay true to yourself, don't avoid them, and no matter how difficult they are. And if you listen to each other and challenge yourself to do the best for yourself, you'll probably achieve that.
I so appreciate you coming and sharing about Willits and just some of your advice and years of being in the industry. And, and mostly in low bid, not always, but mostly. So it's a different animal, takes some different skill sets. And with that, we so appreciate that you came. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Construction Nation dream teams don't just happen, they're built one step at a time. Why not send out this episode to your entire team so they can help you? The more people you have helping, the faster you can build your construction dream team. You can't have your dream until you build your team. Please head on over to constructiondreamteam.com to sign up for our newsletter and to subscribe to Construction Dream Team. We want to see you next time, and I thank you so much for joining me and for joining Pete. And thanks, Pete, for being with us. I'll catch you all next time.